Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel John Giordano. I'm going to be your session chair for this cyber operations series of talks. We have 3 great talks lined up for you this afternoon. If you recall back to General Nakasone and his introductory remarks yesterday, he talked about 3 things, one of them being people. He also talked about partnerships and technology. And then we had General Milley yesterday, who pointed out that there's a generation of attendees at this conference that are of the 25, 26, 27-year age range that will be the future of cyberspace operations. So this afternoon, I'm pleased to welcome these 3 groups of current and future cyberspace operators to talk to us about research they've been doing. Now, many details about Department of Defense cyberspace operations are not releasable to the public. But fortunately, the people that we have lined up for you this afternoon have been doing work that is ready to be discussed at a forum like this. None of what we're going to encounter this afternoon is finished work. Our cyberspace operations begin, effects are achieved, and they end, but research is a continual process. So as we go through these series of talks this afternoon, please keep in mind some of the things that you would like to see these researchers continue to think about and continue to work on, and ask them questions along those lines, and bring your salient points to their work. Because while they are the future of our cyberspace operations, they will benefit from your experience, your knowledge, your wisdom, and your insight. So with that, I want to introduce the theme, Beyond Cyberspace Operations. Sounds pretty generic. This afternoon, we're going to hear about trolls, terrain, and technology in this track. It's quite alliterative. I did not construct that. That's just the way these papers arrayed themselves. We're going to start out with Captain Stephen Hart, Captain Mark Klink. Stephen is a West Point graduate. Mark went to Ball State. And they just recently graduated from our Army Cyber School down at Fort Gordon in Georgia. And they are currently involved in cyberspace operations at Fort Meade. They're going to talk to you about the use of trolls, now not literally trolls, but trolling as a technique in order to achieve effects in the operational environment. So with that, I'll invite our speakers up, Stephen and Mark.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Slide, please. Slide, please. I'm Captain Hart. This is Captain Klink. Okay, thank you. And we're here to introduce trolling as a military strategy. If you could hit the next slide, please. So to introduce this topic, we're going to do a quick case study on the Chief of Staff of the Army. So if everyone was here yesterday, you got to see the Chief of Staff of the Army speak. So we're going to do a simple operation kind of to explain what trolling is and how it can be used. So we're going to put out the message that the Chief of Staff of the Army isn't going to root for Army this year at the Army-Navy game. Crazy. That could never happen. But we're going to make it look like that's what's going on online. So next slide, please. So how we're going to start this operation is we're going to take his official page at army.mil and make it look a little different. This is already a trusted, credible site. All the graphics are put together, all the text is put together for us, and we could use a tool to just download it and serve it up from somewhere else. Slide, please. So for $12 a year, you can have markamilley.com. And this is from Google Domains, and I'm sure there are other senior leaders that are equally available for that low price. Slide, please. So what we put together is we put on his page, or a replica of his page, the message that he doesn't want to root for Army this year because those officers are a bunch of jerks. And so what this is this is a page that could be out there now on markamillie.com, which if someone were to Google him or Google the Army or the Army-Navy game or use any search engine, could be included in the results. And then if that were to be combined with social media, now you have an avenue for a trusted, credible, appearing site, which isn't the real thing, which people could take to believe that the Chief of Staff of the Army isn't rooting for his own team. Slide.
All right, so to illustrate some of the background of what we're considering or what we're calling trolling, we've kind of defined two different eras in the trolling history. So first we have the internet age of trolling. This is the early days of the internet up until a couple of years ago, where a lot of the trolling that was happening was off-topic or offensive material that was traded between people in forums, but it largely stayed online. So what happened online stayed online, didn't really spill into the public sector or the public media. But in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a shift in how trolling is being used into a more information-focused or information age of trolling. We're starting to see the emergence of nation-state endorsed trolling operations at a global scale, and what's happening online now is now being spilled over into mass media and being consumed by people who wouldn't ordinarily get their information from the internet. So American adversaries have weaponized information to attack the American social and political environment. So this is a quick picture that's been distributed around the internet as a way of depicting Russian trolls. To cover basically what we're defining our threat picture as, this goes for both the Americans and our allies. It's estimated anywhere between 500,000 and 2 million full-time paid Chinese trolls are in effect at any given time. And this is based off a research study by Harvard University. We're seeing similar numbers of about 1,000 people that are paid full-time trolls in the country of Russia. And both of these countries, along with numerous other countries around the world and other organizations, are using trolling as a way of influencing popular opinion and using a lot of targeted advertising techniques which are gleaned from the marketing industry in conjunction with kinetic warfare and what's being coined as a new form of hybrid warfare.
Unfortunately, a certain segment of the population is fairly susceptible to trolling. Even though the example that we just gave sounds silly, if you've never heard of who the Chief of Staff of the Army is or you have no familiarity with him, what you find in a search engine results may be very relevant to you, even though that's not something that is put out by a credible source. NATO Stratcom looked at how Latvia was experiencing the annexation of Crimea. And what they found was a certain subset of their population would go onto a legitimate website which had news about the events, and then they would look at the comments where the Russian trolls had put in new comments to say that everything was going great. There are supportive messages in those comments which people are believing to be true and not the actual text of the article. Also, they looked at the Finnish experience. This was journalists, and they found that in that case, what they were doing is they would put together a news article which has some factual relevance. There are pieces of it that are real, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to change the tone and how people are perceiving what's happening in that conflict. In the United States, during the election, there were articles that were put out that kids were being kept inside of a pizza shop. And unfortunately, Mr. Welsh went to that pizza shop and tried to set them free with his weapon and put a hole through their roof before he was promptly arrested. And finally, what I want to point on is that sometimes this can be used in platforms that already exist, such as when neo-Nazis were trying to target religious minorities using Facebook's advertising tools. So the more foreign influence embeds itself into news, services, or other mediums, the more difficult it becomes to identify that you're looking at something that someone is trying to use to change your opinion, and that person or organization could be a foreign intelligence service. So what we think is most relevant in the immediate future is to develop the capability to defend against troll operations. So a defensive troll operation would identify, destroy, and neutralize foreign trolls operating on the cyber personas of Americans and its allies, their leaders, institutions, and persons. And they can start doing that by attributing who is actually putting out that information, getting to the sources. And they can also look at if a news source is coming from somewhere that is illegitimate or puts out a narrative that is always consistent with a certain intelligence source. You could conduct a counterattack where you are stopping the trolls from putting out their message by either taking their access away or conducting a physical removal. And then you could attrit them. So in the case study that we provided earlier, those domain names were $12. So that's a pretty cheap target for someone that's trying to have an effect at low cost. So making it more difficult for them to get into this space and make it so that that isn't attractive to them. You can also try to identify them using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and crawling the web to see where they're appearing and stop that site from reproducing material before it becomes available to viewers. And then an interesting concept we came up with is what we're calling counter-trolling, where you're setting up a message where they're operating from so that they don't even want to do that. And probably what's going to be most important to General Milley after he hears about this talk is providing a VIP cyber persona monitoring and defense service so that those leaders that are in the US are not having their cyber personas trolled and that they can be protected.
So as with any military operation, there's spectrums throughout times of armed conflict of what's right and what's wrong and what's applicable or what fits the laws of armed conflict. Defensive troll operations can be used within any part of that spectrum of armed conflict, whereas offensive troll operations are going to get more into times of immediate necessity or even like kinetic conflict times. So offensive troll operations are going to leverage a lot of technologies from the marketing industry. Specifically, we're looking at computers as persuasive technology, which is a concept coined by Dr. B.J. Fogg of Stanford University. This is a concept stating that you can use technology to elicit some sort of action or response from an individual. So like a lot of you guys have smartwatches that will vibrate to remind you to keep moving or stay active. We can use that same technology to kind of elicit some sort of response from our adversaries or people through social networking or via the internet. And we can scale that same technology in what's known as mass interpersonal persuasion as we try and push a message out throughout an entire populace or region of the planet and motivate an entire group of people to buy into our agenda or our strategic objectives. And then we're also not going to rule out the work that's already been done in the non-cyberspace realms with military information support operations and information operations. Then within offensive troll operations, we've divided it up into two different categories. So we have individual-focused troll operations, then organizational-focused troll operations. So individual-focused are targeting a single individual person and their one or many cyber personas. So we're looking at all the social networking accounts or all the points of presence that a single individual has within cyberspace. Here we're trying to discredit them through embarrassment or exposure. So it doesn't have to be the dissemination of false information to discredit an individual. We can disseminate truthful information that's backed by facts in order to discredit a foreign adversary or target's influence or ability to influence within cyberspace. And then that will in turn damage the person's reputation and hopefully dissuade people from following them within whatever technical means that they're using. Or we can use denial of service on that cyber persona and completely prohibit the individual from using or accessing their cyber persona. And then organizational focused troll operations are much larger scale, so we're using a lot of the same concepts as degrading trust or reputation damage, but we're using this in conjunction with machine learning, and we're targeting multiple physical individuals and their multiple cyber personas. So as you can imagine, multiple people probably have access to any organization's social networking accounts or points of presence within cyberspace. So we're looking at targeting a much larger group of people and a much larger capabilities and maybe even a global span as opposed to targeting a single individual. And then here towards the bottom, we even get into modifying information at the source. So this is where we'd use existing means to modify the message that the organization wants to send before the organization sends it out. So we can kind of get the jump on them, and it would appear from the end user's perspective that the message is legitimate because it's coming from the organization. However, we've interjected our own strategic goals and objectives into that message before it was disseminated. But with any military operation, there's a number of considerations, and we don't have enough time within the scope of our paper or during this talk to cover everything that needs to be covered for troll operations. So we've identified a couple moral and legal considerations that still need to be addressed for trolling to become a viable military strategy. On moral and legal considerations, we're looking at automation as a problem. So as we automate the dissemination of messages throughout cyberspace, we run into legal considerations for disseminating messages on our partners' websites or using social media platforms to disseminate those messages. And we also run into moral implications by potentially having unintended audiences receive our messages. And then we also run into moral considerations when it comes to straying from the Army values. So it's not our intention in any way to stray from the Army values or to disseminate false information unless absolutely necessary in times of armed conflict. And then legal considerations, the authorities within cyberspace are already pretty gray and pretty hard to understand. So interjecting influence and information operations into those domains is going to be an ongoing problem that we don't have an answer for right now.
What we'd like to leave you here today with is that American adversaries are attacking American cyber personas, and the U.S. Army and the United States must combat them. So go Army, beat Navy. If you have any questions, we'd like to open up the floor now to your questions.
So trolling, like information operations in the context of cyber, I think that the technical background required to do cyber, while difficult to acquire, is pretty well understood. You need to know networks, you need to know endpoints, and you need to know software. It's a whole different skill set when it comes to social engineering, the sort of stuff you need to do for trolling. You got to have, political, social awareness. You got to be able to identify when information is inaccurate and why, and what the message is trying to be conveyed is. I don't think our existing cyber training pipelines are well equipped for this sort of thing. Have you done any research into who is currently good at this sort of stuff? What sort of resources could be tapped to get the U.S. Army good at this sort of stuff? Because I feel like while it falls under cyber, it's a very different challenge than one that's traditionally tackled with cyber.
So I think that we originally kind of planned out a sample battalion infrastructure. So what we would recommend as a battalion or our proposed unit buildup. And a lot of that, probably about a third of that, was going to consist of I/O personnel. So people that have from the PsyOps field and from the I/O field that have experience disseminating messages and crafting messages, along with linguists to understand the culture and the language in the area that we're operating. However, I think that there's a gap in cyberspace right now where we're not tapping that to the full potential that we could. And we have some capabilities within cyberspace that we can build upon the existing work that's been done in the I/O community. And I think it'll be a pretty good synergistic effort between the both communities.
I'm Midshipman Rock from the U.S. Naval Academy. If a state actor conducted a severe enough trolling operation against the United States, do you think a kinetic response could ever be considered appropriate?
That would depend on the proportionality of what that attack was, how severe the trolling operation was. It could, at some point, along that spectrum of armed conflict, necessitate a kinetic operation. Without actually knowing the specific type of troll attack that they conducted, it's not easy to say.
All right. So one of your definitions of a trolling operation is releasing actual true information to defame a person of interest. And one of your considered con-ops for responding to that is changing the narrative. Have you considered the legality and even more so than that, the morality of using American military might to influence the actual public perception of U.S. persons?
Yes, we have. So this is not something that would be directed towards a U.S. person. That would be wrong to target people within the United States or Americans. This is something that during times of conflict or war that could be used.
Hey, good afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Whiskey Man, I'm out of CENTCOM. I don't know if the mic is working or not. It is? Okay.
We can hear you, sir.
Then it's all good. Two quick questions for you. What's the difference between MISO and IO in your paper?
So we began to address the difference between MISO and IO, and we got into some issues with disclosing too much information in certain areas. That being said, I think that depending on who we're targeting could determine whether it's a political organization, a government entity, or whether it's a private individual. That could drive whether it falls under MISO or IO authorities.
Okay, so I want to talk to you offline about that because from my perspective, we have a significant community problem identifying what those are. And because we don't have a good framework that we start from, we move down a couple of different lanes. Second thing for you is, how is this different, the trolling, from anything that's happened in the information environment prior to this? Are there any historical examples that you looked at where information has been used to incite violence, just not necessarily through the internet?
So the focus of trolling, as we see it, is to work on the cyber persona. Other operations can take place against the person as they exist in the physical world, and combining those operations certainly has its challenges. This is adding to that, making sure we're focusing on getting how they're consuming that information, which more and more is in the digital realm where their cyber persona is taken into account.
I have a question. You had a slide that was talking about the moral and legal aspects.
Right.
And there was one in particular in the moral saying that you don't want to hurt the person after the war has finished or the conflict has finished for them to continue on with their life. I was wondering, is there a way that you could spin all of this around and make everything positive for the people that you're trying to affect, not the person that you're trying to demean, for example? So to be more specific, if there was, for example, an adversary leadership that was of interest to be targeted in a trolling campaign, instead of trolling that administration, what if it was the people who we were trying to reach and telling them how amazing they are? But I try not to say specifics, but trying to make it a positive spin using their culture, their history, and to show them an alternative, but in a positive way. Does that make sense?
Right, so that's certainly a possibility to put out a message directly to whatever population that you're targeting and making that message positive. What we meant by that particular comment on the slide is that if you do set someone up so that their reputation is damaged and no one wants to follow them anymore, do they have the ability to, after that conflict has ceased, put themselves back together after whatever's happened to them, and are they still able to function? And that's a significant moral challenge, especially when you're dealing with something that is a non-lethal operation, that they should still have the right to be able to continue living and continue being a viable person afterwards.
Hi. So I have just one quick question. Coming from a cyber planning background, trolling operations sounds very great. Most commanders want to know what am I getting? What's the bang for the buck? So have you guys put any thought into measures of effectiveness on these types of operations and what the planners can see or what the commander can say, yes, this would be something that I'd like to do?
A good point.
Okay. So what we were looking at is MIT Social Physics conducted a study where they were looking at measuring how a hashtag was moving through a population. So you could use that to measure your effectiveness. So if in that case, if your audience is using a hashtag to see how that moves through a population, and what they're looking for is people that are particularly well connected to whatever message is moving through, and you can measure it by following those nodes and how many other people within that friend group or social network are also receiving the message.
Is that more measures of performance, not necessarily effectiveness, whether your message is actually getting to the, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you all.
Did a fine job presenting your work, also for pulling off the often difficult tag team talk here. Stephen going without the benefit of a podium to get some cover, concealment, and defilade. Also wanted to thank the audience members for providing engagement through your questions and inquisitiveness. We want our cyberspace operators in the Army and in the Department of Defense to learn and to improve, through their interactions with the operational environment. But we also want them to do that, through education and training. So this is an opportunity for them to bring you their thoughts and for you to exchange that your perception with them, and hopefully shape their work going forward. So Stephen and Mark, I'd like to see you continue down this path and flesh out this idea of trolling, particularly answering the mail with regards to how we measure the effectiveness of that activity. So thank you again, Stephen and Mark. Next, we have Air Force Captain Jeff Guyon, who's coming to us from the Air Force Institute of Technology and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He's got a background in cybersecurity, and right now he's a master's student out there at AFIT. And he and his collaborator have done some work on mission mapping with regards to key cyber terrain. And what we will see is that the missions that traverse our Department of Defense network are often not well understood with regards to how they correlate to cyber key terrain in cyber, mission-relevant cyber terrain. I think you used all three in the paper, which was providing good coverage for the vagaries of natural language. But the concept is still there that we need to understand which components of our infrastructure on our Department of Defense networks are key at any point in time. So I'd like to ask Jeff to come up and begin his talk on the terrain part of our session this afternoon. Jeff?
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about cyber terrain mission mapping. I'm going to give a little background on some stuff that will help understand what mission mapping is, and then talk about some methods and tools that can be used for mission mapping. So what is the problem? I don't think I have to fight too hard to express that missions within the DoD are pretty critically dependent on cyberspace, especially a lot of the speakers we've heard throughout this conference. It's not only is cyberspace a domain of warfare, but it's also something that other domains of warfare are reliant on in order to be more efficient in conducting operations and missions in those domains. So, and the difference between cyberspace and some of the physical domains is it's an environment that's constantly contested by adversaries who can be anonymous and attack from remote areas. There's not a physical necessarily element to the key terrain, whereas if you have control over this area, you have control over that terrain. In cyberspace, it's a lot more ambiguous to what the actual terrain is, and who might have control over it or who might have ability to manipulate or influence it. And this kind of brings up the problem that our missions don't necessarily understand all of their dependencies that they might have on cyberspace. And there's sort of a disconnect between your mission side, operations side, and your IT service provider or cyber defense forces on whose responsibility it is to make sure that mission happens and make sure that the terrain is protected. So currently, we take a very IT-centric approach to cybersecurity. We're trying to protect everything pretty equally. You have your defense in depth, your firewall, intrusion detection, vulnerability management programs. But the computer that I check my email on isn't as important as a computer at the command post that sends out alerts to the entire base, if an incident happens, or a system that's used to, coordinate air refueling missions at multiple bases and, organizations. So how do we identify what are those most important systems, and how do we prioritize our actual cyber defense efforts to focus on those systems that are going to be most critical to mission execution? So I spoke a little on the flip side, where there's that disconnect between mission owners and your system owners or administrators or cyber defense forces. And our cyber risk assessments, so for anyone that's been through like a CCRI, know that they score the network on a baseline. You get a score based on how many vulnerabilities are on your network and how you're compliant with all the STIGs that DISA sets forth. Not necessarily how your base or organization is able to perform the mission that's been tasked to that. So that's sort of where we're currently at. And in the future, we're exploring a concept of moving towards mission assurance. So in the Air Force, we have an initiative to provide an active defense capability at a base level. So, we have our national mission forces and our cyber mission teams, but also at a base level, they need the ability to provide mission assurance of their own bases. So we're looking at, providing a mission owner an active defense capability and exploring, what mission assurance looks like. So, the definition is you're able to perform the assigned tasks in accordance with whatever the plan is. So we see a couple mission assurance methodologies, one from Air Force Research Lab, one from MITRE, and they're two pretty similar processes, actually. So first, you have to understand what the mission is and identify and prioritize what are those mission essential functions, what needs to happen for a mission to execute, or what would constitute a mission failure. Then you have to map out those dependencies on each of the key tasks to how they rely on cyber assets in order to perform those tasks. What's the criticality and the mission impact of those items? Then you could do vulnerability assessment and threat assessment to figure out what are vulnerabilities and threats to those specific cyber assets. Then you get into the risk area where you're mitigating risk or remediating vulnerabilities to an acceptable level. And I was actually doing some light reading last night of one of the conference materials. And actually the first paper by Admiral Barrett is cybersecurity, focusing on readiness and resiliency for mission assurance. And she points out actually a lot of the similar processes. Understanding what needs to be defended for mission assurance is the first step to building a more resilient warfighting platform. And after a commander articulates their no-fail missions, they then identify cyber key terrain supporting the operational platform for information to be used to successfully execute those missions. So that brings us to what we're going to explore further is cyber mission mapping. Actually identifying what the key terrain is for those specific missions, how the mission components depend on cyber components in order to execute. And not just that, but also how do cyber components depend on each other? Because most of the time, our systems are very complex now. They're systems of systems that rely on pulling information from a variety of different sources in order to actually generate a service or provide a piece of information. And they depend on networks, nodes, circuits, physical infrastructure. How do those dependencies look like? What are our points of failure we identify? And what are the specific assets that if are unavailable could result in mission failure? So a pretty simple example, oversimplified, but here's what a basic example of mission mapping looks like: is you have your operational objectives, you break it down to a series of tasks that need to be accomplished, and then break those down into the systems supporting that. And then from there, you could further look to see what specific circuits, nodes, and physical infrastructures might be supporting those systems. So we'll take a look at a few of the different mission mapping methods out there. Within the Air Force, we use functional mission analysis. This comes from systems theoretic process analysis for security, which is a PhD dissertation topic by Colonel Young out of the Air University Cyber College. So basically, this takes a very systems engineering approach to defining what a mission is. So you have your overall mission objectives at a high level, and they require some piece of information. They send some sort of command or interact with different systems, and the systems respond with a piece of information back to them. And this creates sort of a control loop of information, which is very well known in systems engineering communities. I don't really have this strong background in the topic, but the idea is you work with the mission commander to identify what the goals and unacceptable losses to that mission are, and then how can certain system states or signals that might come from the systems result in hazardous conditions, which could then result in an unacceptable loss occurring. And this is kind of a pretty complex topic overall. If you go through it, it's about a week-long course at Air University. So I'm not going to get into too much detail in it, but this is what a lot of the methodologies that our cyber protection teams within the Air Force are using to map out missions and perform survey missions for mission owners to look for risks to their missions. MITRE developed crown jewel analysis, which identifies the cyber assets that are most critical to a mission, and those are your crown jewels. So it involves pretty similarly breaking down a mission into what its dependencies on cyber. So you see at the top, here are your mission objectives. They're going to come from the mission owner, what needs to be accomplished. Then you have your specific tasks that need to occur in order to accomplish those objectives. They each depend on information assets in order to be able to complete that specific tasks. And then those information assets are produced by cyber assets, which are your actual physical cyber devices, systems, applications, or services. And on the flip side, you can use this for mission impact assessment. So if you want to be able to figure out what the impact is of each of those cyber assets, it's some sort of simulation or wargaming to figure out if this asset's not available, what is my impact to my mission? And the effects of that, this outage would propagate upwards to the actual mission. So an outage in this cyber asset affects your ability and degrades your ability to produce these information assets, which would affect the ability to be used throughout these specific tasks, and ultimately it could result in mission failure. Impact dependency graphs are a mathematical abstraction of missions, tasks, and assets. So it's more formally defining a mission as opposed in a graph-like structure where each child node has some sort of dependency or is a dependent of the parent node, and there's some sort of impact that can be calculated for each node what its effect is on the parent. So if you use some sort of logic, and you can use Boolean logic in here as well. In order to produce this mission, I need to complete these different tasks, and each of those tasks are mapped down to different services and assets. So if one of those assets becomes unavailable, you'd be able to calculate what the impact is on the specific mission or task. Ontology modeling is something that was developed by secure divisions of applied visions. It's something that models the relationship between attributes of a mission. So based on entity relationship attribute diagrams. So you have your mission, which is supported by a cyber capability, and that cyber capability is used by users or provided by a cyber asset in this example over here. Secure Divisions was actually Secure Decisions was looking at a way to automatically build these relationship diagrams for the information that's stored on a network. They produce a product called CAMIS, which is cyber assets mapping from users and systems, but it didn't end up being used in any sort of enterprise setting. Then dynamic mission mapping. This is something that we're looking into at AFIT, is how do we capture the temporal nature of missions and use it into a mission mapping relevance. So if we're trying to provide near real-time situational awareness, we need to be able to know when a mission is occurring and what the key terrain is for that mission as it's occurring. And then you'd be able to produce that transparency necessary for a cyber defense team to be able to perform an active defense mission as it's going, understand what the baseline is, what the systems need to be available when they need to be available. So that brings us to a couple of the tools. We have Dagger, developed by the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, Sykes, developed by MITRE, and MADS, developed by the Naval Surface Warfare Center, and it's funded by US Cybercom. So Dagger is a standalone Java application. It displays mission mapping details as a layered form. So at your top level, you have your mission, objectives, tasks, and it flows down to systems and services and physical infrastructure. The layer view is pretty good for representing smaller data sets, but it doesn't scale very well because it's tough to see what the dependencies could be. Here, if you scroll over items, it would show you what the dependencies are, but they're not immediately available. But they're also color-coded based on the status of those systems. So you can set up real-time data feeds which are updated to show potentially what the status of each of those systems are. And if one becomes unavailable, it might become red, and the impact up to the mission might propagate upwards. So if you have a mission that's well-defined and only has a certain number of assets and reoccurring tasks that you can have within your control, Dagger could be pretty good to visualize that. And it's pretty flashy. It looks cool. Mission owners like to see it because it's that stoplight colored graphs. But for our cyber protection teams that use it, they don't really like it because it doesn't necessarily well define the relationships. And it's pretty technical to use and configure. Sykes displays mission mapping as a tree form, and they also have abstracted views where you can drill into information and to see more details of what events might be occurring that are impacting specific things. But it doesn't support any sort of real-time data feeds, so all the events that would be entered are entered in manually by someone. It's deployed as a web application, but for the most part, it's a standalone system, so different systems objects aren't shared throughout different organizations. You need a new instance of Sykes, which prevents the sharing of information. So we could see a little bit more details. If an event occurs that impacts System 6, you can see the effect propagate up to the mission, where it would have a degradation to System 1, and your ability to perform this mission essential function, and that would ultimately degrade your ability to perform the mission. And if you want to see a little more details, you kind of have these abstracted views. You could kind of see what events are occurring that might be impacting the mission, what your system relies on or your task relies on, and what it impacts. And then MADS, I can't show you any images of it because it's not publicly releasable, but it has enterprise capabilities. So if an event occurred that impacted a system, every mission that was mapped to that system would be shown up as whatever degradation or impact would be able to be calculated automatically. It's integrated with some near real-time data feeds, so it pulls from dis-a-circuit status information and pulls general systems from some DoD sources. So it has a decent base of information already. However, it requires a lot of data entry to add new objects and to create impact assessments, pretty DoD-like, to require lots of documentation. And it's not too user-friendly. Different pieces of information are stored throughout the system. It could be hard to figure out what you need at certain times. So some of the shortfalls of the tools we've seen is that they're very technical to use and understand. They're sort of built by technicians for technicians. They're not always great to try to show to a mission owner to have them immediately be able to understand what is going on in this system. It requires some sort of translation. They all require manual data entry, so gathering this information takes a lot of work. You're interviewing mission owners, planners, operators, subject matter experts throughout the network to try to figure out and build these maps. They take a long time to build and populate, and it's a challenge to be able to maintain them, for them to be useful. All of the tools had a very static representation of missions, so aren't capturing this temporal aspect, whereas you just have an overarching high-level mission object, not really capturing that tactical level mission for more real-time situational awareness. And they're not capturing information flows. So the real reason you rely on a system is because it's producing information that you need. If there are other ways to capture that source of information, it's tough to recognize that in just a regular tree structure. There needs to be a way to capture what information could be flowing through these objects and what the value of that information is. And then they all lack the ability to perform a risk assessment. So mission impact assessments are good, but they're reactive. They're responding to a certain event and telling a mission owner, hey, this is the battle damage assessment. This is what's going on. Whereas a risk assessment is proactive. It can help identify areas where you need to prioritize either cyber defense activities or resources to patch certain systems. If you're able to pull in threat information and vulnerability information, then you're now able to say, hey, we have this vulnerability on a system that is being exploited by, WannaCry ransomware. This is a high, impact to your mission. If this was exploited, you need to, resolve this before we take further steps to planning the mission. So currently we're looking into solving some of those shortfalls I mentioned, building a more dynamic mission mapping tool with ability for both mission impact assessment and risk assessments. But I want to save a couple minutes at least for questions, if anyone has any. And if we run out of time, my contact information is right here. I'm always looking to take feedback and comments.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm in grad school too, so I understand what you're going through with that. I'm wondering if you've started looking into specifics for doing risk assessments, because I'm assuming since this is like a framework, you're not actually going to be looking at like an active system. Maybe you're looking more for like metrics on like if there's a vulnerability, how easy it is to exploit by what threat with what capabilities. Is that correct?
Right. So that was some follow-up work that I've been working on. Upcoming in March, the International Conference on Cyber Conflict and Warfare and Security or something, ICCWS. I'll be presenting on cyber risk assessments using this mission mapping framework. So if you're interested in more, we can talk offline.
John Eubank here with Enlighten IT Consulting. MADS, I believe, actually just transferred over to Air Force under the Joint Cyber C2 program. So I think there's much better direction there to reinvent what MADS is. And I know APL was walking around, so might want to keep the comments about Dagger on the down low. But the hardest part of all of this is the data at the end of the day. How do you see automating getting mission-relevant data and then identifying the data that's sitting on existing assets and which assets have mission-critical data? How do we go about actually identifying those assets that hold the key data?
Yeah, and right now, there isn't a reliable way to automatically pull that sort of information at all. It does require a lot of rigorous work to, interview all the different stakeholders responsible for executing a mission and really building out that mission map that isn't always available for the operators. Sometimes, a mission owner doesn't really understand even how their mission executes, is what we've sort of seen from our cyber protection teams going out and doing FMA on missions, is you kind of realize things that may be vulnerabilities to the actual process itself as opposed to, it's different systems that are on the network. So it really just takes some just retrospective looking into what the mission, how it's occurring, and then figuring out what are the actual unacceptable losses for that mission, what it can, your no-fail list, as Admiral Barrett put, and figure out how that information is captured and what can cause it to fail, I think. So it's a lot of work, ultimately. Thanks, sir.
I'd like to thank Jeff for not just for the talk, but also for pulling off the almost as difficult as the tag team talk. He gave us the Prezi demonstration today, which we appreciate. Before I hand off to our last speaker and introduce him, I do want to take one moment. I'm going to steal this right now. Not just for me, but hopefully for you all. I want to take a moment to recognize our ACI staff who've been working, the rooms here, but particularly in this room. They're the individuals wearing the yellow lanyards. they've been responsible for keeping us on time, on target, making sure everybody's had enough opportunity to give their talk and that you've had the opportunity to ask your questions. They've been working hard throughout the duration of the conference. When you get a chance, please give them a thank you. Also, if you think you've derived value from this SciCon conference, I would encourage you to reach out to Colonel Andy Hall, our ACI leadership, whomever you might know from the organization, or let me know, because the fact of this conference occurring was not necessarily a given, given the competing priorities that ACI has to attend to. And if you did derive that value, it's great to express that in surveys or send emails. But that human dynamic, that human element, that people part of the equation, reach out to those ACI leaders and let them know how much you got out of this and what you might have thought of the event. So that hopefully that will contribute to sustaining this going forward. So this will be our last talk for this session. This is our last paper track before we move across over to the Atrium Hall for our last two keynotes. So I hope you've enjoyed what you've gotten out of cyber operations. Right now, we're going to hand off to our last speaker, Major Rock Stevens, who's currently a student at the Navy War College up in Rhode Island. Rock is a lifelong learner. He's graduated from West Point. He is working on a master's degree while at the War College. He's all but dissertation at the University of Maryland. And Rock has looked at a problem which I characterize as, and he characterizes as, undisciplined integration of technology into combat systems. So Rock is going to talk about what he sees as potential vulnerabilities, and going forward from this talk, hopefully he's going to be contributing to those solutions as he becomes a leader in cyber operations for the Army and for the Department of Defense. So with that, Major Rock Stevens.
Appreciate it, sir.
Finish strong.
It's an absolute pleasure to present this research to you all. It's also great to see so many friendly faces in the crowd, so hopefully it's enjoyable for you to sit through the next 25 minutes. Change things up. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please raise your hand. We'll get a mic too, and go ahead and answer it as we go along. If we could start, that'd be sweet. Yeah, well, yeah. Irony. We can go ahead and start. All right, so the U.S. has a history of integrating technology in its weapons platforms to achieve an advantage over the adversary. And we have examples that date back to World War II, where we have the introduction of precision guidance munitions. Moving forward, we have the development and integration of stealth technologies. And even on the modern day battlefield, we see the implementation of tactical all the way up to strategic drones, as we're able to synchronize the effects of weapon systems on the battlefield to achieve a victory over our adversaries. Still don't have that slide deck up. But moving forward, we can see how the United States has continued its interest in integrating technology through the 2017 defense budget proposal. And in this, there are 5 tenets. 4 of them, when we get the slides up, you'll see are very much reliant on technology integration within moving forward over the next 20, 25 years. We can come back to those. So going forward to slide 4. Yeah, so now that we understand, the United States military's history integrating these within our combat platforms, where we want to go forward, we also need to understand the current environment when it deals with vulnerabilities within technologies. There was a 2016 survey of IT systems within the Department of Defense done by the Government Accountability Office that found the Department of Defense is spending a lot of money on maintaining legacy systems. Maintaining legacy systems across the entire enterprise. Namely, one thing I found laughable was the utilization of 8-inch floppy disks to manage our nuclear command and control systems. So critics of this will say, well, actually, 8-inch floppies are technology that predate the first computer virus. So this is probably more secure than anything we're running right now. That might be true. However, as we begin to layer new technologies and new digital sensors within these command and control systems, they're able to inherit modern-day vulnerabilities into these legacy systems, and worse off, they're creating new vulnerabilities that we hadn't seen before when you have this marriage of modern technologies and old systems. Almost. All right, so other examples that I want to call out from modern media that we've seen is, for one, 2007, the Department of Energy had Project Aurora, where they had a generator connected to a network system, launched a cyber network attack against it, resulting in a big boom. A couple years later, in Germany, we see another steel mill explode due to a cyber attack. Steel production is something that's existed since the 1800s, and it's nothing new to Germany and what they did, but how they're layered new digital sensors. There we are. Can we go back one? Yeah. So if any of you are interested in the actual defense budget, those last 5 tenets on there are the ones I was talking about, and the last 4 being the ones that very much require technology integration within the weapons platforms. Any chance we can full screen it, please? Thank you. All right, so back to the German steel mill. Well, we saw, what happens when you have layered technologies on top of it and resulting in a catastrophic loss. There are no reported casualties with it, but, it's still an unfortunate event. And this year, we saw the RAND Corporation publish the white paper, 0 Day, 1,000 Nights. One of the key findings from this paper was that it takes vendors approximately 6.9 years to identify and fix vulnerabilities within their own software base. On the flip side, we look at what the adversaries are able to do. On average, 22 days to identify a vulnerability and weaponize it into a working exploit. Given that asymmetric difference between attackers and defenders, it's something that we must consider as we continue to rely on technology for winning our nation's wars. Lastly, I'd like to bring attention to the 2017 Defense Science Board Task Force, which had some interesting findings. One good thing that we are doing is that we have program protection plans in place for all new acquisition systems, where the IT and digital components of all weapons are being thoroughly audited for security. On the flip side of that, these PPPs did not exist for anything that's already fielded within our modern fleet. So we simply don't know and don't have the mechanisms in place to force the manufacturers of these weapon platforms to go back and do an audit. So throughout the paper that complements this presentation, we use the joint functions that are defined in Joint Publication 1.0 and 3.0, as well as the operational factors of time, space, and force to talk about how vulnerabilities within our technology that we integrate with the weapons platforms could result in a catastrophic loss of life for our troops. Throughout this presentation, I'll be focusing on the joint functions, and each one of them alone is important, but you also must consider how they all feed upon one another, and we'll touch on that throughout the presentation. Command and control. One essential element of command and control is the command and control systems that enable that, a shared operation platform. Well, an essential element of that is our reliance on GPS. All of you have phones on you right now that have GPS sensors in it. And we've seen a rise in commercial off-the-shelf capabilities. For as cheap as $20, you can buy a GPS spoofer and jammer. So when you take that availability and look at how U.S. military is using GPS, there's some concern there. In 2013, researchers at the University of Texas at Austin conducted a proof-of-concept attack against a yacht. In this spoofing attack, they forced the yacht to all of its digital sensors to read that it's hundreds of meters off from its actual location. And as I mentioned, all of you have phones with GPS. A lesser known essential aspect of GPS is how we use the timing signals from GPS for secure military encryption. So with a loss of GPS or a loss in confidence of its signal, it's going to force us to use less secure communication means, which would be more advantageous for an adversary to go and intercept, essentially leaking operational security plans to the adversary. And in modern news, I'd like to bring to attention maritime vessels outside of harbor in Russia. All of their sensors at the same time reporting that they were located 12 miles inland at the site of the Sochi Olympics. This revelation led researchers to speculate that this is now Russia integrating new TTPs within their information warfare capabilities. Robots. So the robot that's pictured here is the DARPA Atlas robot. And the intent for this design is to assist with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So you can imagine a Fukushima-style event where we want to help out a partner, yet we're not willing to risk lives in such a non-permissible environment. Human-machine teaming, one of the essential components of the 2017 DoD budget, features proposals like this. And as we begin to look at ways to integrate robots within our own TTPs, and also decisions that we might have to weaponize these robots, something that we must concern ourselves with is, how do we trust the integrity of the signals that are sent to these robots? Furthermore, how do we ensure that only friendly forces are assessing them? Well, actually, to back up one. So there was a recent report this year by the company IO Active that did an assessment, a very cursory assessment of lots of commercial off-the-shelf robots that were available for purchase. They found that most of them were exploitable, not through any vulnerability, but just because of poor web admin panels or default credentials. Of the ones that they weren't able to use these particular findings on, they were easily exploitable. In my other life as a researcher at the University of Maryland, we did some exploitation of computer vision systems, giving it a faulty input and taking full control over the system after the fact. So this is a very important considerations for us moving forward. Fortunately, we have capabilities like cyber reasoning systems. We saw the debut of these at 2 years ago at DEF CON during the Cyber Grand Challenge. If you're not familiar with cyber reasoning systems, what they are is autonomous systems that can automatically enumerate the attack surface of a code base, identify vulnerabilities, and on the fly generate exploits. So how can we use this within the DoD? I believe that we can digitize a lot of our systems to include the robots that we're looking at fielding for humanitarian assistance, and continually conduct pen tests on them to identify vulnerabilities, patch them, and when we patch them, ensure the patch doesn't induce new vulnerabilities. It's an amazing opportunity that we have there, leveraging something by a partner organization like DARPA. Intelligence. So we must consider the 2009 essential theft of schematics and code base for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. And in this, we saw a couple years later, China debut the J-31, which had striking similarities to our F-35. So with the outright theft of IP and essentially conducting the research and development for our near peer, we also must consider, how do we ensure that the code base that is left behind has integrity, that there's nothing inserted there. More importantly, it's not just a US issue as the Joint Strike Fighter is being fielded to allies. Another consideration with respect to intelligence is the rise of commercial off-the-shelf drone capabilities, where you have companies like DJI. They're producing some of the best available drones for very cheap. When you compare what the high-end DJI drones can do versus the tactical equivalent for the Army, like the Raven is about 100 times more expensive. So when you have a particular operation where you want a one-time use of a drone, well, we need it quickly. It might make sense to go out and purchase an off-the-shelf, and if we don't care if it comes back or not. One consideration is, security researchers identified a covert back channel that was uploading metadata to DJI. DJI is a Chinese company, and as we understand relations with China and the companies that operate within its borders, we can postulate that there's going to be third-party access of all metadata for every drone that DJI has fielded. So with that, you understand why it'd be not advantageous for our operators to use these type of things on the battlefield. So the Army, showing its adaptiveness, has outright banned use of commercial off-the-shelf drones for use in combat operations, showing that, hey, presented with evidence, we can take the appropriate policy actions. Sustainment. We are absolutely unable to win our nation wars in a prolonged engagement without secure lines of communication. With that, we must consider, how do we conduct sustainment? There's an increased reliance on commercial partners for doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the US military. And because of that, we've pushed a lot of our sustainment down to the unclassified networks. So if there's an operation that wants to have a shipment from A to B, and let's say it's going over an unclassified wire, and we're using insecure protocols such as file transfer protocol, which transmits usernames, passwords, and all the information in clear text, we can very easily imagine a scenario where there's a man in the middle, where instead of going from A to B, it's now diverted to C, and an adversary has launched a denial of service attack on troops on the ground. So something that we readily need to assess is what security technologies are we integrated within our systems? And once something is identified as obsolete, how do we force the partners that created it for us to modernize it? So, how many systems do we have that still rely on MD5? Because of the hash collisions is obsolete. How many of our other systems use FTP? That's been replaced by secure copy and SSH. With fires. Earlier I talked about our desire for developing and fielding next generation precision guided munitions. But when a lot of these start using GPS for its accuracy, and then we lose that GPS capability or we can't trust it anymore, we have to revert back to dumb bombs. Dumb bombs are way cheaper than PGMs, and so a lot of people are like, hey, this is not a bad thing. It's not the end of the world. We can still conduct our missions. But if we look at the efficacy of dumb bombs in the Vietnam era, where we dropped 16 million tons of munitions over the country with very limited effects, and then also you must consider surface danger zones, where we have friendly forces in the area with inaccurate weapons. Are we putting our own troops at risk due to our reliance on now dumb bombs? So this is my favorite slide of the entire presentation, mainly because I get to make fun of Navy a little bit. And just an all-around interesting slide. So I'll start in the bottom right, where we see the USS Guardian, MCM-5. On its maiden voyage outside the Philippines in 2013, the MCM-5 mine countermeasure Avenger-class platform hit a shoal and never sailed again. So in the finest naval traditions, they fired the captain of that ship and conducted a full-bore investigation as to what happened. One of the findings was that a corrupt digital nautical chart was used in a transfer from origin to that ship. This DNC is used, much as your GPS navigation system in your phone tells you how to go from A to B to C all the way to your final destination. So when they actually hit the shoal, they believe the shoal was several miles away from its present destination. So you can imagine a scenario where we continue to not verify the integrity of DNCs, and an adversary is able to go in and successfully craft a malicious DNC that conducts a denial of service attack on all of our vessels. Something to be concerned of. Moving to the ground realm, 2013, researchers from the University of Washington were able to conduct 2 proof-of-concept attacks on brand new vehicles. And in these attacks, they were able to gain full control over the vehicle. And this was more publicized in 2015 by hacker Charlie Miller as he partnered with Wired magazine, resulting in a vehicle, 2015 Jeep, being operated by a driver, veering off onto the side of the road. And this was, again, because we have legacy systems. Cars are not a new thing, but because we're layering all the niceties of Bluetooth and all the modern digital sensors on it, we now have new vulnerabilities within traditionally secure platforms. Moving down to the air domain. The pictured here is an LUH-72 Lakota. It's a semi-autonomous bird that's used for light medevac and also VIP transport. In this, they also use a waypoint system where they upload where they want to go, the altitude along the way, hit go, and off they go. So as you can see, if we continue to use systems that don't verify the integrity of what we're giving it, we continue to put ourselves at risk. So moving forward, I've pitched what I think the military should do a couple of times, actually at a Cyber Talks a couple of years back, and I am going to stay with it. I think that we have some amazing opportunities internally, and that we have an amazing opportunity to provide robustness to our enterprise. A couple years ago, we saw the Hack the Pentagon program. And in this, when it went live, within 13 minutes, a vulnerability was disclosed that was verified. In addition, thousands came over afterwards. This is awesome. But this is a slide I stole from a presentation I gave at Usenix Lisa, a business conference last week. The Hack the Pentagon is essentially a limited scope program where we're worried only about that green circle over there. In that green circle, hackers have at it, get whatever you want. But that red square, under no circumstance will you touch that, because that's the most valuable assets within our organization. And if you attack that, That's an unacceptable loss. But note, our adversaries don't have a limited scope. That this little red square here is accessible to our adversaries. So we're intentionally building blind spots by having limited scope engagements. And not only is that something that we're allowing, we're advocating for, because stay out of my red box. So I've received some harsh criticism, lots of hate mail to my personal account pitching this. Because, we have cyber protection teams. We have, other organizations that do internal assessments. Absolutely right. But then imagine the absolute enormous scale of digital systems across the Department of Defense. Do we have a network map of all the network systems, of everything in the DoD? Do local networks have that? Right. So the efficacy of using these teams for doing the assessments, I just don't think is there. And if we have the cadre in-house with the capability, the clearance to do so, I think it's a shame that we're not. So this is another slide where I highlight Army leading the way with their efforts with cyber support to core and below. This article was featured on NPR, where we see our cyberspace operators at the tactical level conducting GPS jamming attacks against tankers. What happened was a catastrophic loss of life in the simulated event. And this is awesome, because what we're doing here is we're exposing these troops that are preparing for combat to a real-world vulnerability. I think we can take it one step forward. All of these things I've talked about are unclassified, and they're proof of concepts publicly available. Let's use them. There's nothing sensitive here. Let's expose our troops to all of them, because operating systems with technology in them that are vulnerable is the new norm. So let's not wait until there's a high-intensity conflict when we have troops deployed that we allow them to experience this for the first time. You take into consideration the concept of stress inoculation, where they've experienced it over and over and over while you're training. So when it happens in real life, it's like, oh, hey, I've experienced this before. Let's get after it. So I'd like to leave you with a quote by General Stanley McChrystal. When General McChrystal was with the Rangers preparing his men for deployment, he understood that the OPFOR had absolutely stacked the team against him, that there was no way they could legitimately win at JRTC, getting ready for this deployment. And then they realized, hey, let's game the game. Let's win this. And so with that, future combat would be unpredictable in nature. And winning at JRTC, with the odds stacked against us, would build the Rangers' confidence that we could win at anything. This was a commitment to fighting and winning the kind of war that we were in, not the one that we wanted. So by leveraging everything we can throw at troops that are preparing for combat, I think we can achieve this. You've given our troops the confidence they can go in and beat any adversary they face. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Maybe one more here too.
Howdy, my name is Conrad Hawk. I'm a cadet at Texas A&M.
Gig 'em.
Whoop. So I have a question for these hardware issues you're finding.
Yeah.
What areas specifically have you found that can have immediate turnarounds as far as securing these hardware systems that are having, with the tanks you just said?
Well,
where do you see immediate progress or potential progress moving forward with R&D efforts?
So I did a presentation a couple years ago at ShmooCon where we talked about the computer vision vulnerability. And we were able to control whatever we wanted, given it an ugly input. And with 4 lines of Python code, we're able to sanitize any of our exploits against it. And so, I mean, we need to understand what inputs are we allowing to touch our systems. And this is a software issue, this is a hardware issue. Are we allowing inputs? Because that's an attack vector that someone could leverage. And once we identify essentially a whitelist for what inputs we should allow and explicitly block everything else, that's going to fix a lot of problems. And then with the DARPA cyber reasoning systems, I think that's another way for us to achieve code coverage and continually assess the security of these platforms, even after they're fielded, If we have a digitized replica of a tank, of a LUH-72, of whatever, just let this bad boy crank on it repeatedly until we find vulnerabilities. And if nothing's found, then hey, we have a secure platform that's fielded. Oh, we're out. Okay.
What would you say is the lowest hanging fruit, and how would you garner support for some of these transitions that you're kind of advocating for?
Yeah, so I think the Hack the Pentagon program was awesome, and that we have lots of metrics that support that this is a good idea. But there's no sensitive systems attached to pentagon.mil. So if we open this up to every .mil public-facing web domain, I think that's one step that we could go forward. And then baby steps forward to maybe one day there's a secret program, a top secret bug bounty program moving forward. Yeah, so thank you. Appreciate it, sir.
Excellent job, Rock, in overcoming adversity and demonstrating that you don't really know your research until you have to give your talk with no notes or slides, a close corollary of the postulate that you should never ask an aspiring PhD about their research unless you have half an hour to kill. So well done, Rock. Thank you to you. Again, thanks again to our ACI staff. Thank you as audience members and attendees at the conference for joining us here at SciCon. We conclude the cyber operations track. If you have any additional questions for any of the presenters, I know that some of them put up their contact information. I know Rock will remain around. We had to cut things short to keep everything on time. We have 2 more keynote talks that will occur at the top of the hour, just across in the atrium hall. So I'd like to thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I look forward to seeing you and working with you all in the future. Have a good day.